for communicating complex ideas, Professor Richard Dawkins was a perfect choice as the first holder of the Charles Simonyi Chair in Public Understanding of Science at Oxford. He's a graduate from there. He did his doctorate under the Nobel Prize-winning ethologist Nico Tinbergen. And in 1967, he was appointed Assistant Professor of Zoology at the University of California at Berkeley. And he's returning to Oxford in 1969, and he's been a Fellow of New College since 1970. He burst out of academia, really, into the public realm with his first book, The Selfish Gene, in 1976. It's an acknowledged masterpiece of science writing, which became an immediate bestseller, and it's been translated now into all the major languages. The Blind Watchmaker, 86, won the Royal Society of Literature Award and the Los Angeles Times Prize, and other resonant titles followed, like River Out of Eden, Climbing Mount Improbable, Unweaving the Rainbow, The Greatest Show on Earth, and most recently, The Magic of Reality, a science book for children. He's lectured all over the world, and indeed this is his first engagement since a month-long tour throughout October of the United States. In 1991, he gave the Royal Institution Christmas lectures in London. He's also a broadcaster, whose documentary films are The Root of All Evil from 2006, The Enemies of Reason, The Genius of Charles Darwin, and Faith School Menace. And this year, he was profiled in the BBC 4 series Beautiful Minds, and on Radio 4's The Life Scientific, a three-part series on More 4, Sex, Death and the Meaning of Life, concluded only this week. His awards have included the Silver Medal of the Zoological Society of London, the Royal Society's Michael Faraday Award, and the Nakayama Prize for Achievement in Human Science, the International Cosmos Prize, and the Kistler Prize. He has honorary doctorates in both in science and significantly in literature. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society. The God Delusion, published in 2006, the same year as the 30th anniversary edition of The Selfish Gene, has achieved greater sales figures worldwide than any of his other works. And you could also say it's created a new publishing genre. It's almost like one of these games where you try and make as many words out of a fixed number of letters as you can. I couldn't find a reliable account of how many responses have been published, but in 2010 there were 47, among them Dawkins' Dilemmas, The Devil's Delusion, God is No Delusion, The Irrational Atheist, Atheist Delusions, The Dawkins Delusion, Is God a Delusion, The Dawkins Letters, God Doubting Dawkins, The God Reality, Doubting Dawkins, God Actually, Why God Probably Exists, Deluded by Dawkins, The Deluded Atheist, The Divinity Code, etc., etc. And already in this festival we've had 2 responses to the God Delusion, so I think it's now time for the response to the responses. So please welcome Professor Richard Dawkins.
Well, thank you very much, and I must begin with an apology. As Roddy has just said, I've been traveling in America for a month, and I'm not very good at reading emails when I'm in America. I thought I was coming here to talk about the magic of reality. And somewhat to my dismay, I looked at the program and saw I was billed to talk about the God Delusion. So I've been working rather hard today, and I hope the result will justify that. I'm going to begin by reading the opening paragraphs of the God Delusion, which I think give a flavor of the problem that I faced. The boy lay prone in the grass, his chin resting on his hands. He suddenly found himself overwhelmed by a heightened awareness of the tangled stems and roots, a forest in microcosm, a transfigured world of ants and beetles, and even, though he wouldn't have known the details at the time, of soil bacteria by the billions, silently and invisibly shoring up the economy of the micro-world. Suddenly, the microforest of the turf seemed to swell and become one with the universe, and with the rapt mind of the boy contemplating it. He interpreted the experience in religious terms, and it led him eventually to the priesthood. He was ordained an Anglican priest and became a chaplain at my school, a teacher of whom I was fond. It is thanks to decent liberal clergymen like him that nobody could ever claim that I had religion thrust down my throat. I put a little footnote in here to say our sport during lessons was to sidetrack him away from scripture and towards stirring tales of fighter command and the few. He had done war service in the RAF, and it was with familiarity and something of the affection that I still retain for the Church of England, at least by comparison with the competition, that I later read John Betjeman's poem. Our padre is an old sky pilot. Severely now they've clipped his wings, but still the flagstaff in the rectory garden points to higher things. In another time and place, that boy could have been me under the stars, dazzled by Orion, Cassiopeia and Ursa Major, tearful with the unheard music of the Milky Way, heady with the night scents of frangipani and trumpet flowers in an African garden. Why the same emotion should have led my chaplain in one direction and me in another is not an easy question to answer. A quasi-mystical response to nature and the universe is common among scientists and rationalists. It has no connection with supernatural belief. Apollo, Wotan, Zeus with his thunderbolts, Thor with his hammer, Baal, Mithras, and Amun-Ra, all were once worshipped as gods. People believed in them, prayed to them, sacrificed to them, lots of people. They were intimately intertwined with their cultures and literatures. Children were brought up in the knowledge of them, told of their existence as a matter of undoubted fact. Nowadays, everybody agrees that no matter how sincere those believers undoubtedly were, they were deluded. Every one of those gods was a delusion, and so were countless others that anthropologists have described for us all around the world. Everyone today agrees that all those ancient gods were delusions. Now, yesterday, David Robertson was inclined to ridicule this statement, which, by the way, many people attribute to me, but which didn't originate with me. Some of us just go one God further. That seems to me to be an absolutely unassailable reaction to what we've just seen, that all those other gods, all those thousands of gods that people have believed in throughout the ages and in different parts of the world and which are no longer believed in, why on earth should we be so arrogant as to think that our God, the God we just happen to have been brought up with as Christians or Jews or Muslims, is the one true God that's going to escape the removal that all the other ones have suffered? Hindus believe in Lord Krishna, Lord Ganesh, and Lord Vishnu. They believe in evidence. They don't have evidence, just as Francis Buffett has just said, but they have strong feelings. They believe internally for exactly the same kinds of reasons as he does. Their feelings are just as unconvincing to scientists, precisely because they are personal, internal, undemonstrable publicly. People feel all sorts of things internally, and we have no reason to take their feelings seriously because they are not public. They're private. Anybody can say, I believe so-and-so for private reasons. It's just an accident that Francis Buffett, and I dare say most people in this room, many people in this room, happen to have been brought up in a Christian culture. You'd have completely different beliefs if you'd been brought up, say, in India or in the Viking lands in earlier times. Why does Christian theology deserve more serious attention than Valhallan theology or Olympian theology? Theology, the subject, the academic study of theology, as in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the lecture we heard last night, that's different. That's a proper scholarly pursuit. But theology as in arguing about the nature of God, about the nature of the Trinity, the nature of transubstantiation, is that really a proper subject for intellectual discourse, as Francis Buffett has just argued? disputing over whether a wafer, when blessed by a priest, literally turns into a first-century Jew, or only metaphorically, does not strike me as a productive use of brain time, not a suitable subject for learned books and lectures, because there's no evidence you can bring to bear. Anything you say on the subject has to be simply made up. Now, the question of the existence of some kind of giant intelligence, which we may as well call God, is, I think, a supremely important question. A universe with a God would be a totally different kind of universe from a universe without. And it would be a scientific difference. This seems to me to be a thoroughly interesting, important, worthwhile question, even if it's not an easy one to answer, or maybe impossible to answer. It's important to understand what the question means. I really am talking about a personal God, a personal intelligence, such as Yahweh, Jehovah, Allah, Baal, Wotan, Zeus, Lord Krishna. If, on the other hand, by God, you mean nature, or goodness, or the universe, or the laws of physics, or the spirit of humanity, or Planck's constant, then none of the above applies. An American student asked her professor whether he had a view on me. "Sure," he replied, "he's positive science is incompatible with religion, but he waxes ecstatic about nature and the universe. To me, that is religion." Well, if that's what you choose to mean by religion, that's fine. That makes me a very religious man. But if your God is a being who designs universes, listens to prayers, forgives sins, wreaks miracles, reads your thoughts, cares about your welfare, raises you from the dead, then you're unlikely to be satisfied. As the distinguished physicist Steven Weinberg said, if you want to say that God is energy, then you can find God in a lump of coal, but don't expect congregations to flock to your church. When Einstein said, "Did God have a choice in creating the universe?" he meant, could the universe have begun in more than one way? When he said, "God does not play dice," this was his poetic way of doubting Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle. Einstein was famously irritated when theists misunderstood him to be talking about a personal God. He was passionate that he did not believe in a personal God. But what did he expect? The hunger to misunderstand should have been palpable to him. You often meet so-called religious physicists, but they usually turn out to be religious only in the Einsteinian sense. They're atheists of a poetic disposition, and so am I. But given the widespread yearning for that great misunderstanding about a personal God, for Einstein deliberately to confuse pantheism with supernatural religion seems to me to be an act of intellectual high treason. So accepting that the God hypothesis, as I shall call it, is a proper scientific hypothesis whose truth or falsehood is hidden from us only by a lack of knowledge, a lack of evidence, what should be our best estimate of the probability that God exists, given the evidence now available? I think it's pretty low, and I spend a couple of chapters of the God Delusion explaining why. Most of the traditional arguments for the existence of God, from Aquinas on, are, I think, pretty easily demolished. Several of them, such as the so-called first cause argument, work by setting up an infinite regress. Everything has to have a beginning, and that infinite regress has to be stopped somewhere, so you wheel out God to terminate it. But nobody ever tells us why God is somehow magically able to terminate regresses while needing no explanation himself. We do indeed need some kind of explanation for the origin of all things, the origin of the cosmos, the origin of the laws of physics. Physicists and cosmologists are hard at work on that problem. But whatever the answer to that question, a random quantum fluctuation, a Hawking-Penrose singularity, whatever we end up calling it, it's got to be simple. Complex, statistically improbable things don't just happen. They demand an explanation in their own right. They are impotent to terminate regresses in a way that simple things are not. The first cause cannot have been an intelligence, let alone an intelligence that answers prayers, enjoys being worshipped, cares about your sex life, and so on. Statistically improbable things, intelligent, creative things, come into existence late in the universe as the product of some kind of gradual process of which evolution is the only one we so far know. A gradual escalation from simple beginnings. Simple things are easy to understand. Complex things require a special explanation. Darwin gave us that explanation. Complex things can only come late into the universe and cannot be responsible for designing it. Now, this is where I have my sharpest disagreement with Francis Spufford, and I'll return to it. He thinks it's an adequate answer to the point I've just made to say that, oh, well, theologians have never thought God was a complex being. Well, I'm sorry, but if you don't think God's a complex being, then he can't do the job you're asking of him. You cannot have it both ways. Either God is simple, in which case he can't design universes, or he's complex, in which case he can't just magic into existence. He needs an explanation. The only one of the traditional arguments for God that is today widely used is the so-called argument from design, although since the name begs the question of its validity, it should really be called the argument for design. It's the familiar watchmaker argument, which is surely one of the most superficially plausible bad arguments ever discovered. And it's rediscovered by just about everybody until they're taught the logical fallacy of it and Darwin's brilliant alternative. In the familiar world of watches and other human artifacts, complicated things that look designed are designed. To a naive observer, it seems to follow that similarly complicated things in the natural world, like eyes and ears and hearts, must be designed too. It's not just an argument by analogy. There's a semblance of statistical reasoning here. It's fallacious, but it carries an illusion of plausibility. If you randomly scramble the fragments of an eye or a leg or a heart or a kidney 1,000,000 times, you'd be lucky to hit even one combination that could see or walk or pump or filter or do anything useful. And this demonstrates that such devices could not have been put together by chance. And of course, no sensible scientist ever said they could. Lamentably, the scientific education of most British and American students omits all mention of Darwinian natural selection, and therefore the only alternative to chance that most people can imagine is design. Even before Darwin's time, the illogicality was glaring. How could it ever have been a good idea to postulate, in explanation for the existence of improbable things, a designer who would have to be even more improbable? The entire argument is a logical non-starter, as the great Scottish philosopher David Hume realized, although apparently Francis Spufford doesn't, before Darwin was born. What Hume did not know was the supremely elegant alternative to both chance and design that Darwin was to give us. Natural selection, which is a supremely unrandom process, a supremely non-chance process, is so stunningly powerful and elegant. It not only explains the whole of life, it raises our consciousness and boosts our confidence in science's future ability to explain everything else. Consciousness raising, the feminists introduced us to that phrase, and I want to use it to talk about natural selection, Darwin's idea of natural selection, raising our consciousness to the power of what the philosopher Daniel Dennett has called cranes as opposed to skyhooks. A skyhook explains nothing. It's something that, it's a great hand that comes out of the sky. It's simply conjured out of thin air, and then it's supposed to do explanatory work, but it doesn't, because it has no explanation of its own. A crane, on the other hand, really does explanatory work. A crane is something that lifts from below. Natural selection is the crane par excellence. It's cumulative, starts from simple beginnings, works its way up by gradual degrees to prodigious heights of complexity and improbability, which, as Hume said, strike us with wonder. Now, Francis Spufford says at this point that theologians don't claim that God is an evolved creature. And this, I think, misses the point of the crane argument. It doesn't actually matter what theologians think God is. What matters is whether God provides an adequate explanation for the existence of the complexity of life and of lots of other things as well. And I maintain that he doesn't. Natural selection is not just an alternative to chance, it's the only ultimate alternative that's ever been suggested, the only one that works. Design is a workable explanation for organized complexity, but only in the short term. It's not an ultimate explanation, because designers themselves need an explanation. Francis Crick and Leslie Orgel, Francis Crick, the great molecular biologist who discovered the structure of DNA, Crick and Orgel once playfully speculated that life on this planet might have been deliberately seeded by a payload of bacteria in the nose cone of a rocket. A pretty fanciful theory, and I think they suggested it with tongue in cheek. But the point is that even if that theory was right, ultimately the aliens who seeded life on this planet would have to have had an explanation on their own. You can use design to explain life on this planet if you say the designers were on another world and they wanted to colonize the Earth with their own form of life. You can use the word design if you wish, but then you're still faced with the problem of explaining where those alien designers came from. Ultimately, you've got to stop postulating designers and postulate a real explanation, a crane rather than a skyhook. Now, my conjecture that evolution, Darwinian evolution, is the only explanation for life in the universe may be wrong. It's possible that there are other processes that we haven't yet thought of. What's certainly true is that nobody has yet thought on this planet of an alternative, not just for life on this planet, but for any kind of improvement, ultimate improvement in complexity. But natural selection has to get started somehow. We do need an origin of life. We do need a first step, and that first step is the origin of the first self-replicating molecule, the first molecule that can make copies of itself, the first gene in the general sense, although it probably would not have been DNA. So the origin of life on any planet would have to be, on present theory, would have to be the origin of some kind of primitive gene. On this planet, it probably happened about 4 billion years ago. Nobody knows quite how it happened. Conditions would have been very different. Scientists are working on various speculations as to how it happened. We are entitled to postulate a very improbable event as the origin of life, although I prefer not to do so. Once the first gene is in existence, then the whole process follows simply and easily and gives rise to elephants and lions and oak trees and humans. But it could well be a very improbable event that started it off, the origin of the first gene. 1 billion is a conservative estimate for the number of planets in the universe. Just suppose for a moment, and I don't believe this, but just suppose that life's origin on a planet demands a hugely improbable stroke of luck. So improbable that it happens on only 1 in a billion planets. Well, any scientific grant-giving body would laugh at a scientist who appealed for money to work on a problem with only a 1 in a billion chance of succeeding. Yet if there are 1 billion planets in the universe, and actually there are a lot more than that, almost certainly, if there are 1 billion planets in the universe, then even such absurdly low odds as 1 in a billion chance of life arising on a planet would still mean that there are 1 billion planets with life on them. And this is where the famous anthropic principle comes in. Even if life is excessively rare in the universe, even if only a tiny handful of planets have life, even if only 1 planet in the universe has life, then that has to be this planet, because here we are. That's the so-called anthropic principle. I don't actually believe life is all that rare. I suspect it's fairly common, but possibly not common enough for us ever to encounter it, which is rather sad. If you set out in a spaceship to find the one planet in the galaxy that has life, the odds against your finding it would be so great that the task would be indistinguishable from impossible. But since we're alive here, we don't need to get in a spaceship. We can actually see life happen here. I think the anthropic principle is really rather elegant. And as I say, I don't believe that the origin of life was as improbable as all that. I think the galaxy probably has plenty of islands of life, even if they are spaced out. It's a bit like a sort of cosmic Polynesia with canoes not venturing very far from the island, so each island doesn't know that, that there are any other islands that have life. Well, it's fairly easy, as I've just done, to apply the anthropic principle to planets. It's usually applied rather more in a rather more difficult way, not to planets but to universes. Physicists have suggested that the laws and constants of physics are too good, as if the universe were somehow set up to favor our eventual evolution. It's as though there were a few dials, and I've drawn the dials there, as though there were a few dials which you twiddle in order to set the major constants of physics. You twiddle the knob and you set the gravitational constant and the weak force and the strong force and various things like that, never mind the details. Physicists have suggested that any of those knobs could be turned to any value you like apart from the ones they have, and immediately life would be impossible, the universe would fizzle out before it came into existence. You need to have those physical constants very precisely set in order to get a universe that's capable of bearing life. And you can try to estimate these very, very low odds of all the knobs being exactly, precisely twiddled. And of course, religious people would like to suggest that it's God that does the twiddling. It's God who sets those physical constants to precisely the right values, because he's calculated in advance exactly what they need to be in order eventually to yield life, and human life, presumably. But as we've seen, that explanation is vacuous because it begs the biggest question of all. The divine knob twiddler would himself have to be at least as improbable as the setting of his knobs. He certainly could not be simple. Again, the anthropic principle delivers its devastatingly neat solution. Physicists already have other reasons to suspect that our universe, everything we can see, everything in the observable universe, is only one universe among perhaps billions. We're not talking about billions of stars now. We're talking about billions of universes of which we can only see one. Physicists have good reasons to postulate this. They postulate a kind of foaming universe with each bubble in the foam being one universe. We are just in one bubble. Of all the universes in the foam of universes, only a minority has what it takes to generate life. Only a minority has the knobs twiddled into exactly the right position, set in exactly the right position. Our familiar laws of physics are local. We happen to be in one of the bubbles which has the right qualities to give rise to us. Obviously, or we wouldn't be here. We've got to be in the right kind of universe to give rise to us. There may be billions of other universes that have no life at all. But if there is one bubble in the foam of universes that has the right physical constants, then that bubble has to be our bubble, has to be our observable universe. The anthropic principle entitles us to postulate a massive dose of luck in accounting for the origin of life on our planet and in accounting for the origin of a cosmos suitable for giving rise to us. But there are dramatic limits to the anthropic principle. We're allowed one stroke of luck for the origin of life. We're allowed perhaps a couple of other unique strokes of luck, unique events, like the origin of the eukaryotic cell. That's the rather complicated kind of cell that animals and plants are made of as opposed to bacteria. Perhaps another unique stroke of luck in the evolution of a really complex brain capable of consciousness and language. But those limited strokes of luck are the end of our entitlement. We emphatically cannot invoke major strokes of luck to account for the rest of life, to account for the illusion of design that glows from each of the billion species of living creature that have ever lived on Earth, to account for the magnificent diversity of animals and plants that we see repeated again and again in different continents and in different eras. The evolution of life is a general and continuing process, producing essentially the same kind of results in all species, in all continents, and in all geological eras. You can't invoke luck to account for that. What you invoke is Darwinian natural selection. If you pick any hitherto unstudied species and subject it to minute scrutiny, any evolutionist will confidently predict that each individual will be observed to strive, to work, do everything in its power to stay alive, to survive, and to reproduce in the particular way of the species. If it's a plant or a herbivore, a carnivore, a honey eater, whatever it is, an insect eater, whatever its method is, it will be striving to survive and pass on its genes, pass on the DNA that rides inside it. That's a prediction. We won't be alive for long enough to test it on all creatures. But we can say with great confidence that, because we know what happened in the past and we know what happens in different continents, if, and probably when actually, another comet strikes the Earth as large as the one that killed the dinosaurs 65 billion years ago, that even if all the mammals are wiped out, as all the dinosaurs were wiped out by the last catastrophe, something will arise to take their place, and the same cast of characters, broadly speaking, will evolve. This is a prediction we can safely make because it happened when the dinosaurs went extinct. All the different kinds of dinosaur were replaced by mammals that did the same kind of job. And even before the dinosaurs, you saw the same thing. When the dinosaurs went extinct, the mammals filled their shoes separately in Australia, in South America, in Madagascar, in Asia, and filled their shoes in similar ways. There's predictive power in the theory of evolution. So we explain our existence by a combination of the anthropic principle for very, very rare events, and Darwin's principle of natural selection for the common events of life. That combination provides a complete and deeply satisfying explanation for everything that we see and know. Not only is the God hypothesis unnecessary, it's spectacularly unparsimonious. Not only do we need no God to explain the universe and life, God stands out in the universe as the most glaring of all superfluous sore thumbs. We cannot, of course, disprove God, just as we can't disprove Thor, or leprechauns, or fairies. But like those other fantasies that we can't disprove, we can say that God is very, very improbable. And it's no good appealing to learned theologians. It just happens that God, the God of Abraham, has spawned schools of learned theologians, but there's no reason whatever to take what they say about their gods any more seriously than what a hypothetical fairyologist would say about fairies. There is no evidence for either fairies or gods. I want to end with a few slides to illustrate the contrast between the scientific attitude to the world and the religious attitude to the world. And I want to begin with a hypothetical edition of the Quarterly Review of Biology, which is a scientific journal which is taken by biologists and contains scientific papers based on original research. And I'm imagining that I'm the guest editor of a number of the Quarterly Review of Biology, and it's a special issue on the question, did an asteroid kill the dinosaurs? As you know, I've just been talking about it, it's fairly widely accepted that it did, but this is a hypothetical issue of the Quarterly Review of Biology devoted to the question, did an asteroid kill the dinosaurs? And the first paper is a standard scientific paper, iridium layer at KT boundary, and I can't really read it, something between something about a crater in Yucatan indicate that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. The President of the Royal Society has been vouchsafed a strong inner conviction that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. It has been privately revealed to Professor Huxtane that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. Professor Haldley was brought up to have total and unquestioning faith that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. Professor Hawkins has promulgated an official dogma binding on all loyal Hawkinsians that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. Do you see the difference? The first one is science. All the rest are exactly the way theologians talk. Here's another particular little bee in my bonnet that I want to talk about. The labeling of children with the religion of their parents when the children are too young to know what they believe. At Christmas a few years ago, The Independent, which was the paper I took in those days, was looking for a nice seasonal picture for Christmastide, and they found a heartwarmingly ecumenical one at a school nativity play. The three wise men were played by Shadbreet, a Sikh, Musharraf, a Muslim, and Adele, a Christian, all aged 4. Just imagine the outcry if the caption had read, Shadbreet, a monetarist, Musharraf, a Keynesian, and Adele, a Marxist, all aged 4. Or Shadbreet, an atheist, Musharraf, an agnostic, and Adele, a secular humanist, all aged 4. Mightn't the parents actually be investigated to see if they were fit to bring up children? I want to return to consciousness raising. When you hear somebody talk about a Catholic child or a Protestant child or a Presbyterian child or a Muslim child when they're very young like that, you should say there is no such thing as a Catholic child, no such thing as a Protestant child, no such thing as a Muslim child. There is a child of Catholic parents. You can say that. That's true enough. The picture, in case you're wondering, on the right is a picture of so-called Catholic children trying to go to school in Belfast through a terrifying gauntlet of hatred and abuse and thrown stones from a Protestant mob. Francis Spufford quoted something from me which he didn't like, and I want to defend it. One of the main things I have against religion is precisely not just that it labels children, which I've just dealt with, but also that it teaches children not to think for themselves, but to be satisfied with something less wonderful than scientific truth, and to believe it because they're told it on authority when that authority is not based on evidence. To deny a child the knowledge of why a hummingbird's beak is shaped as it is, or why cheetahs are so fast, is it because antelopes are fast too? How did bees discover how to make honey? Why do flowers attract them? These are all questions for which science knows the answer. In cases where it doesn't know the answer, it can teach a child the proper way to go about finding out what the answer is. This is all denied to a child who is taught the shallow, parochial, empty beliefs that are taught by religious faith. How do beavers know how to build dams? Why are giraffes so tall? What are those birds up to on the giraffe's neck? How did whales get so big? Who are the most close cousins of whales? Would you believe that hippopotamuses and whales are close cousins? Hippopotamuses are closer cousins to whales than they are to pigs or cows. That is an astonishing fact. It's a fact which we've known only for the last 10 or 15 years. We now know it absolutely beyond all possible doubt. It's an enthralling, a thrilling fact, something that children would really love to learn about. But are they taught it? What makes a plover run and then pause, run and then pause? Why do eagles have those beautiful parted feathers at the tips of their wings? We know why that is. Why do flying birds of all kinds look as though an aeronautical engineer had designed them? Where does the illusion of design come from? It's a fascinating story to which we already know the answer. There are plenty of things we don't already know the answer to. And science is an open-ended project that is waiting to discover new answers. How did we get here? Where are we in the universe? A few years ago, I made a television program called Root of All Evil, and I was very unhappy about that television program. It was about religion, and I insisted that religion is not, in fact, the root of all evil. I tried my damnedest to get Channel 4 to not use the title Root of All Evil. The only concession they made was to allow me a question mark at the end. So religion is not the root of all evil, but it does get in the way of a proper appreciation of the world and the universe in which we find ourselves, in which we're privileged to find ourselves and privileged to understand how we came to be there in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Richard's kindly agreed to an extended question and answer sessions, and because I'm in the chair and I asked him, I get the first go, so I have a couple of questions. The first one really is, it's been suggested by more than me that you've basically got two jobs. That one is as a preeminent scientist, and the other is as this scourge of religion. And I can't help thinking about how very different the constituencies for these two jobs are. In one, you are immersed in academia, your work is peer-reviewed, it's published in learned journals, accessible only to the most elite minds. And in the other, it's open season. Everybody has usually a very extreme opinion of you. You can be caricatured, you get toxic emails and hate mail. Every utterance is screened for gaffes, and you can be quoted out of context and misrepresented and so forth. And it struck me that that's almost a job description that a senior or a radical politician might recognise, and I'm not sure how you can quite reconcile these two roles that you have and are recognised to have.
Well, to me, are we hearing all right? To me, there are two aspects of the same thing. I believe passionately in truth, and I think the end of my talk showed why I believe that there is an incompatibility. As for the hate mail and things like that, I think really the less there is in the way of evidence for people to argue in favour of their position, the more they have to resort to hatred and abuse. Scientists, as you rightly observe, on the whole don't vilify each other. They do occasionally, but usually they don't, because they know that the arguments ultimately can be settled by evidence, and the reason they're having an argument is usually that there's so far not enough evidence. But they pay lip service to the idea that one day there will be enough evidence, and so there's no point in being extremely angry about your disagreement. But if your disagreement is about two different interpretations of the transubstantiation, or if your disagreement is about whether God exists or not, and you can't get the evidence, then you do tend to resort to aggressive language, and so there could be a sort of inverse correlation there, I think.
Okay. The other question was, you are first and foremost a scientist. I think you're on record as saying that, of course. I was listening to a Radio 4 program, Beyond Belief, several months ago, and it had interviews with several scientists of faith, so names you know, I'm sure, Osama Hassan, John Lennox, Graham Swinnard, and Mark Vernon, who's better known as a commentator and a journalist on that. I think he's a doctor of theology and a philosopher as well. I think he was the agnostic among the nest. But there was an interesting point I thought made at the end when the presenter asked us why it seemed that there were more physicists of religious faith than biologists, and it was Vernon who suggested that he thought was because evolution as a theory was pretty much unassailable, but physics had gone through massive gear changes. You know, you had Newtonian physics, Einstein relativity, quantum theory, multiverse, string theory, recently the Higgs boson, and I kind of thought it's not so fanciful to imagine physics in that sense as being like a kind of giant onion which is being unpeeled all the time, and who's to say there isn't a god at the very middle of it?
Yes, that's a very interesting point. Two different studies have been done of fellows of the Royal Society and their equivalent in America, members of the National Academy of Sciences, which are the sort of elite scientists of those respective countries, and the Royal Society, of course, is Commonwealth countries as well. In both cases, the number of religious believers was somewhere around 10%. About 90% were non-believers. But in both cases, it's true that physicists were slightly more likely. I forget exactly what the figures were, but it was something like 92% of biologists didn't believe and 90% of physicists didn't believe, or something like that. It's not a big difference, but it is in the direction which you indicate, and it very likely does have some significance. And I think you've probably put your finger on it, that the difficult problem of biology, the deep problems of biology, the ones identified by William Paley in his Natural Theology at the beginning of the 19th century, were solved by Darwin. And ever since Darwin, we've been kind of cleaning up the details. But the deep problems of physics have been on a kind of roller coaster. At the end of the 19th century, so there were some complacent physicists who thought, well, that's physics pretty much wrapped up. And then relativity hit, and then quantum theory hit, and if you try to read a book about quantum theory, it's bewildering how often things change and how often the current dogma gets reversed. So physicists are accustomed to a rather more breathtaking roller coaster ride, and so naturally enough they feel less confident that they can answer the problems that the world throws at them. What's not clear to me is why, given that you're not confident you can answer them, you therefore think that a supernatural explanation is the appropriate way to go. If there's something you don't understand, and there's plenty we don't understand, if there's something you don't understand, then the right response is to say, well, we've got to roll up our sleeves and work on it. We don't just sort of lie down and say, oh, well, we don't understand it, so it must be supernatural. That's a cowardly, lazy way out. And the best physicists, in my view, don't do that. But that might slightly account for this very, very marginal difference between physicists and biologists.
Well, as a biologist, there's another question, which is really, will religion one day be located in an area of the brain? You could say, in a sense, the world, the universe exists between our ears. And I ask because I remember many years ago, someone close to me became a religious convert, and our minister described it to me in terms of that she had discovered a talent or a new aptitude. So what's wrong with that? I'm sure you've heard this before, that people like you are really just tone deaf, colorblind, you're an acoustician, not a musician, you don't hear the music, the message isn't coming through to you.
Yes, I mean, no doubt all of us
it's
are
just different kinds of brain.
Yeah, yes, I mean, all of us are deficient in some respects. Some of us are tone deaf. There are some people who have a wonderful synesthetic perception of colour, and they relate different colours to different sounds. And I was talking to a friend who has this gift, and she was saying that those of us who haven't got it are impoverished, like somebody who's colourblind or as you say, tone deaf. I mean, I find it an unpersuasive thing to say that not believing in the supernatural. I mean, it seems to me the right and proper thing is to say, what evidence is there for the supernatural? What evidence indeed could there be for the supernatural? You know, there may be people who are incapable of empathizing with other people, people who have certain syndromes like Asperger's syndrome or autism, are said to be incapable of empathizing with other people. And I suppose a religious person would say that I'm incapable of empathizing with God. But other people exist. Other people can be demonstrated to exist. I think that the primacy of evidence is what I would always fall back on.
Mm-hmm. And my final question really is, it's I remember some years ago you shared a stage with Richard Holloway, who I know reasonably well because he was the chairman of the Scottish Arts Council for a number of years. And it was something he wrote actually in the review of Francis Spufford's book, which he said, we know science gives us an accurate reading as it can of the way things function, but the picture it presents leaves some of us with a kind of resonant absence. And it is this sense of absence that religion tries to explain. Can you understand or appreciate what he's trying to say there?
Yes, Francis Spufford said it eloquently that you know, explaining isn't enough. But people have feelings, and they feel a need for something greater than just explanation. But the universe doesn't owe us that kind of consolation or feeling. There's no reason why a universe should give us that kind of satisfaction. If you find yourself dissatisfied with the world of science, the world of explanation, and you feel there must be something more, well, that could be just tough. Maybe there isn't anything more. The mere fact that you feel the need for it is not evidence that that need will ever be satisfied. Why should it be? People may say, I feel the need for love, but nobody loves me. Well, that's tragic that nobody loves you, but still, it's a fact.
Okay, I'm going to turn the audience loose on you. First question, please. Is Reverend Shona Boardman, yes, Anglican priest.
First thing I'd like to say is thank you to Falkland for inviting Professor Dawkins. I thank you and I commend you for having open dialogue, because I believe that open dialogue in areas of faith and non-belief is part of an evolving society. No, I'm not a creationist. Yes, I do believe in natural selection. When I was first ordained as a priest, my bishop, who I must say, if you had a pointy hat and a stick on, carrying a stick, Professor Dawkins, you would look exactly like him. Very uncanny. When I was ordained by Bishop Brian Smith of Edinburgh, he said to me, one of the most important things in your ministry is that you must remain friends with people who have no faith. So I can honestly say that some of my best friends are atheists. And so the brand of atheism that you present, I must say, is only one brand of atheism. It's not the only thing to believe in as an atheist. And it somewhat behooves me to say that the way that you bash religion is very akin to the way that the fundamental Christians outside who are protesting your existence bashes science. You use the same techniques, the same tactics, the same language, and that actually troubles me for atheists. So I'm just putting that out there to you and to the audience.
Well, thank you. I'm familiar with the criticism. It arises often. I do think there's a really big difference, though, between the fundamentalist Christian who believes what he believes because he's read it in a book, and I believing what I believe because I've seen the evidence. I mean, there actually is a difference. It doesn't apply to you, of course, but it applies to apparently the people you've described outside the fundamentalist Christians. They probably do think that the world is only 6,000 years old, because a lot of people do, certainly more than 40% of the American population do. And they base that on reading a book. which, as any theologian will tell you, should not be read literally. But that's what they do. And what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to say, oh yes, well of course I respect your position? I don't respect their position. It's absolute nonsense. And the evidence shows it. I have much more respect for your position, and I hope I show that. And I frequently, I have very civilized conversations with bishops and vicars and people, indeed collaborate with them in opposing fundamentalists of the 6,000-year persuasion. I actually got together with the Bishop of Oxford, and we rounded up, I think, half a dozen bishops and half a dozen fellows of the Royal Society to write a joint letter to Tony Blair protesting about a creationist school in the north of England. Tony Blair brushed us off without a decent reply, I may say. But that was a collaboration between me and the Bishop of Oxford and half a dozen other bishops. So I am happy to have a civilized conversation with a vicar, with a bishop, with a priest. Probably not with even with a creationist. I have a good laugh with them. But I don't think I should mince my words when, for example, the accusation that's often leveled at me that I use extreme language. Let me give an example where this was given. I wrote a review indeed of a book in the New York Times in which I said, anybody who claims to be a young earth creationist is either ignorant, stupid, or insane. Now that sounds like an extreme thing to say, it sounds like a very rude thing to say, but it is literally true. And I went on to say, ignorance is no crime. I went on to say, I'm deeply ignorant of baseball and American football, and I'm ready to be enlightened about baseball and American football. So somebody who believes the world is 6,000 years old is just, well, either stupid or insane, we set that on one side, but probably just plain ignorant. And it's my fault as a scientist for not getting out there, scientists generally, for not getting out there and showing people the evidence, because the evidence, once you've seen it, is totally unassailable, as you know yourself. But not everybody does know it, and it's because they haven't been properly educated. So if I sound fundamentalist, I'm not fundamentalist, I'm passionate. I'm passionate about the truth. And the truth for me is what you get from evidence. And so that's why I may sound passionate. But I think it's possible to exaggerate the similarity between somebody like me and a fundamentalist.
Well, since you've got the mic, yeah, don't hog it.
Thank you. Just an observation. In our library here in Stornoway, there's lots of books on the subject. You'll be pleased to know that Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris are in the religious section of the library, as befits two horsemen of the apocalypse. But Professor Dawkins, you've been either relegated or promoted to the sociology section, next to biology. And I was looking at your books this afternoon. Now, I'm a chemist. I'm coming at this focused on the science. And I've studied Darwinism, of course, at the Open University. And I think I've got to disagree with probably everybody in this room so far about the power of what natural selection can do. There's also another book in the library, Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe, which I would encourage everyone here to read because it puts the things in its proper perspective. I was astonished, Professor Dawkins, how you were able to say repeatedly, Darwinism is all we need, but yet go on to talk about a hint of some of the many gaps in the power of natural selection, which is only trying to pick from chance events. It's great for just showing us that dogs come from other dogs and various beaks, but it doesn't tell us where the finch comes from. And there are massive gaps in what you've said, but at the same time, on your website, you were trying to legalize the teaching of evolution from 5 years old to our children, to encourage atheism at a very young age.
Well, hang on a minute. Encouraging the teaching of Darwinism is not encouraging atheism per se.
I apologise for that then. But it's still it's still, we could have the situation where you're filling the gaps with your faith that sometime in the future, the facts will show that the whole of life was able to happen through purely materialistic means. Others in this room have faith that that will not be the case. There is no doubt that evolution has happened. We are now more complex than life is more complex now than it ever was. The fossil record shows that since life in its complicated animal forms began in the Cambrian. But it's still your faith against others. Don't you agree?
You're sitting next to a theologian who would almost certainly tell you never appeal to the God of the gaps. This is one of the great theological no-nos. You're going to lose if you do that. Of course there are gaps in our present knowledge because our present knowledge is incomplete. That's why we're still working on it. And as long as there are still any gaps, you can go and say, oh, we've got a gap there. I mean, people talk about gaps in the fossil record, for example. They love gaps in the fossil record. And they'll say, where's the missing link? Where's the missing link? There's a gap between this fossil and this fossil. And of course there is, because fossils are very rare things. Somebody then finds a fossil that splits the difference, that fits neatly into the middle of the gap. Oh, now we've got two gaps. That's literally what happens. There are gaps in the complete account of evolution. We do not know exactly what happened in every stage, every step of the way in the evolution of every animal that's ever lived. Of course we don't. We know the principles of how it works. Wherever it's been looked at in detail, those principles have been found to work. Wherever people have dug more deeply, either literally into the ground or into the evidence, they have found that it holds up. The so-called evidence against evolution is always of this form. It's always of the form, aha, you can't explain so-and-so. So either we say, okay, we'll put a PhD student on to go explaining so-and-so, and then they'll say, oh, well, you haven't explained this one, or you haven't explained that one. That's no way to make a general argument.
Yeah.
Professor Dawkins, thank you for speaking to us tonight, and I hope you have a pleasant stay while you're on the islands and sample some of the Lewis hospitality that you're famous for. As far as my question, I'm not sure where to begin.
Can I ask from here on in that people at least try to be concise? You know, no speeches, please, or whatever. So,
I'm sorry that thanking someone for speaking is not concise.
Well, the first bit's okay. I'm just worried about what might come after.
Well, as far as my question goes, I'm not sure where to begin. There were so many inconsistencies and wild speculation in what you said. You compared believing in Christianity as akin to believing in fairies. What is believing in multi-universes akin to? Where is the evidence for that, I ask you? But I think what I want to bring up, the point I want to bring up, I could bring up many, but the one I want to bring up is, you said that people believe what they are brought up to believe, i.e. what their families have brought them up to believe. I think you're a living example that that's not the case. So how do you explain that there's more Christians in China than there is the whole population of Great Britain put together, or that there is a huge number of Christians in India under severe persecution, and yet they worship Christianity? These are questions which I think you gloss over, the facts that there are over 1 billion people, according to Wikipedia, in the world that would identify themselves as Christians.
Well, obviously, I would never suggest that it's an unbreakable rule that everybody follows the religion of their parents. Of course they don't. I mean, I don't. Actually, my parents don't have much religion, but plenty of people don't. And of course, it's also true that plenty of people are converts, and there are missionaries beavering away in places like Africa and China, and they are causing people to convert. That's beyond doubt. I'm not quite sure, but you seem to be suggesting that Christianity might have some kind of inherent merit that means that people convert to it more than other religions. I don't know whether there are any Muslims here who would care to comment on that. I don't know what you're saying. I never said that everybody inherits the religion of their parents. It's just a statistical generalization that the vast majority of people who are religious have the same religion as their parents. There are many exceptions, and when there are exceptions, you'll usually find that there's been some kind of missionary activity, perhaps by a charismatic missionary figure such as Billy Graham, or by just ordinary missionaries who go out to faraway places and convert people. Yes, it does happen. I think it's deplorable, but it happens.
Gentlemen, just wait for the mic, please.
Thanks very much. The discussion that you were just having there leads on to another question that I'd like to ask, and that's, do you believe that there's something endemic in the biology of the human brain that tends to gravitate towards a belief in the supernatural? Or is that in itself simply a matter of environment, and it depends on whether you grow up in a place where it's acceptable or it's unacceptable not to be religious?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Anthropologically, it's certainly true that I think just about every culture in the world has something that you could call religion. It's extremely widespread. So in the same sort of way as you can say that heterosexual desire is a human universal, but not everybody has it, but every culture has it, you could say the same thing of religion. Of course, the details of the form that the religion takes are entirely local, and that depends upon local tradition. But is there some inherent human tendency to gravitate towards religion? Yes, I think there probably is. I would put it as psychological predispositions, perhaps a little cluster of psychological predispositions, which together or even separately tend to push people into the arms of religion. The kind of thing I'm thinking of as a psychological predisposition might be a tendency to obey authority, or another one might be a tendency to detect the hand of agency where there may be none. Let me deal with the second one first. If one of our wild ancestors in Africa, where our species evolved, sees something rustling in the grass, it could be the wind, in which case no action needs to be taken, or it could be a crouching leopard, in which case you better take urgent action. Now, the probability that it's the wind is much higher than the probability that it's a leopard, but the danger of making a mistake if it's a leopard is much greater. And so the tendency to believe that things that happen in the world are the result of malevolent agencies rather than the result of just plain forces of physics is a powerful one. And so that could have spawned the sort of primitive worship of thunder and rain gods and river gods and things like that. The other one I mentioned was a tendency to obey authority or believe authority. Once again, it could have genuine advantages to believe whatever your parents tell you, for example, because a young child is a helpless, vulnerable creature, likely to be killed at any time, and the best guarantee of safety would be to follow parents' advice. If you see a rustling in the long grass, run away, or don't bathe in the river because there might be crocodiles. Don't go near the cliff edge because you might fall over. A child had better believe what a parent tells it rather than show a proper scientific skepticism and say, thank you, mother, but I'd rather put that to the experimental test. Don't do that. Just believe what your mother tells you. Well, now, if the child brain is pre-programmed by natural selection with the rule, believe whatever your parents tell you, the child brain will be unable to distinguish between sensible advice like don't bathe in the river and nonsensical advice like sacrifice a goat at the time of the full moon. but as far as the child brain is concerned, both pieces of advice come from the parent, and both are likely to be equally valid, and both should be taken seriously. Now, the precise nature of the sacrifice of goat at the time of the full moon, of course, will depend upon whatever the local culture is. But once a tradition grows up, that you've got to sacrifice a goat at the time of the full moon, or you've got to face east and pray 5 times a day, or whatever it is, that's the one that's going to get passed down from grandparent to child to grandchild, and so on. So those are 2 possible psychological predispositions which might lead people to fall into the hands of religion. And particularly because of the rule, believe what your parents tell you, that's an automatic recipe for whatever beliefs happen to arise in the culture for whatever reason to get passed on and to be ineradicable or very difficult to eradicate, precisely because children do believe what their parents tell them, who have in turn believed what their parents told them, who in turn believe what their parents told them, and so on. And so in ancient Greece, you got everybody believing in Apollo and Venus, and I mean whatever it's called, Aphrodite, and so on. And in the Nordic lands, everybody believed in Thor, and the Jews believed in Yahweh, the Canaanites believed in Baal, and so on. The details don't matter. What matters is the tendency for each generation to swallow whole the dogmas and doctrines that get passed down from past generations. And it's quite difficult to shake off, as anybody who's been indoctrinated as a child in one of the more ruthlessly indoctrinating religions can tell you. Even those who've given up Roman Catholicism, for example, will sometimes right into old age retain the primitive fear of hell, which dates from their childhood. Even if they call themselves atheists, they may still find themselves unable to shake off the terrible weight of childhood indoctrination.
Hello, Professor Dawkins. It was very good to see that you came here, an eminent man from Oxford. I'm afraid the person on one of your slides couldn't spell argument, but that's to be expected.
Oh no, how terrible.
But my problem is, basically, I can't imagine infinity. Therefore, there are obviously lots of things out there that I can't imagine. Tell me about infinity.
Right.
I think I agree with...
Okay, I mean, I can't imagine infinity either, and mathematicians have techniques to handle it. I actually find infinity rather a frightening prospect. I mean, I find the idea of time going on forever and space going on forever not only unimaginable, but actually rather terrifying. But my brain was never designed by natural selection to understand infinity. It was designed by natural selection to understand short distances, the sort of distances you need in order to plan a hunt or an expedition to find a waterhole or to gather yams or berries or something of that sort. Infinity was not something which we were equipped by our brains to understand. Clever people, physicists, people like Einstein, and have managed to tame infinity with their formulae, with their mathematics, with their theories, and so it is something that the human brain, rather marvelously actually, is one of many things that the human brain is capable of, if not deeply understanding, at least handling and coping with, using the tools of mathematics, the tools of logic, the tools of thought. So I'm rather proud actually to be a member of a species which, even though I don't actually understand quantum theory, nevertheless I'm proud to belong to a species in which my fellow humans, some of them, can understand quantum theory, or at least can do it to the extent of testing its predictions, which are astonishingly accurate. And the same thing with relativity. But the fact that I and you can't understand infinity, or the fact that I and you can't understand probably lots of things, doesn't mean that we need to resort to the supernatural in order to explain it. How on earth can that help us? Rather, what we say, well, I don't understand it, maybe one day I will, maybe somebody else does, maybe somebody else will, is something that we can work on trying to understand. But to say that it's supernatural is just giving up. It's just cowardly. It's just lazy. I'm sure you're not saying that, no. Well, science falls off the edge in two ways. One, things we don't yet understand, and there are plenty of those. And science is a humble discipline which actually thrives on what it doesn't know, because what it doesn't know tells it what to work on. So there's plenty that we don't yet know and need to work on. There may be things that we can never know, which is more disturbing, but even the things that we can never know are still worth working on in order to try to understand them.
There are things that we can never know. That leaves room for religion.
No, it doesn't. Because religion doesn't solve the problem. If there's something that we can't understand, how on earth does it help us to understand it? To say God did it. It just doesn't even begin to help to understand it. We can say, no, I don't understand it yet. I'm going to go on trying to understand it. Maybe I never will, but meanwhile, let's work hard to do it. It cannot help to say, oh, well, God did it, something supernatural did it. That's just giving up.
Yeah, we're almost getting into Donald Rumsfeld territory of known knowns and unknowns and unknown unknowns, and I find infinity gives me vertigo. Just wait for the mic, please. It's being recorded for radio. Who's got the mic?
It's actually over here with
oh,
me
sorry.
Again, sorry.
Okay, Francis, since you've got it,
yeah.
you know, possession is 9/10 of the law. Yeah, so you've got the mic.
More civilized than that, I think.
Yes, okay.
I don't go to the supernatural in search of explanations for physical phenomena. I don't go there as a last resort.
No, you
I'm
made that very
stuck.
clear.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good. I'd also like to add something about children, which is connected to that. I think we're clearly going to go on talking past each other about the question about where explanations stop and what kinds of explanations do what kinds of things. But I am very clear when I talk to my 7-year-old daughter that if she wants to know about the shape of the hummingbird's beak, she will get the proper evolutionary explanation for it and why cheetahs run fast and what the link is between the speed a cheetah moves and the speed an antelope moves. On the other hand, if she asks me what she should do when she feels she's done something wrong, or if she asks me why friendships end, or if she asks why her grandmother has dementia, I will give a mixture of different kinds of explanation, and I do not feel that I am taking away from her capacity to work things out for herself. If we didn't give religious explanations to our children, it's not like we wouldn't give them any explanations. Every culture in every state gives its young tools to understand with. And I don't think you should underestimate the power of people as part of the maturing process to turn around and look critically at the tools they've been given. I am happy that my 7-year-old thinks of herself as a Christian, but I fully expect that when she's 13 or 14 she will acquire a revolting set of piercings and probably cease to be a Christian. In fact, I will be a bit disappointed if she doesn't, because I would wish whatever she believes to be truly her possession. I would want her to reject what she was only given and subject it to the test of experience. I think you are underestimating how often religion is prized by people because it passes the test of experience.
Right, thank you. First, of course, I don't doubt that you accept the scientific view of all those questions. You then turn to the moral questions and things like, what are you going to tell your 7-year-old about whether she should feel guilty when she does something wrong? I agree, and you didn't suggest this, but anybody who suggested that science can answer that sort of moral question, I would disagree with. I don't think science can answer that sort of moral question. I think that a scientific way of thinking about morals in the guise of secular moral philosophy actually can, not that it can answer the absolutely fundamental questions of what we value, but given that we have sort of axioms of the fundamentals of what we value in our morals, in our ethics, then secular moral philosophy, which is a kind of scientific way of thinking, logically, can point out contradictions. If you believe so-and-so is wrong, then you're inconsistent to believe that such and such is right, say. So that, I think, is a valuable thing for adults. Now, for children, I would have thought that what most people would want to do, and I would have thought you would probably did too, is not say, don't do that because God doesn't want you to do it, but don't do that because how would you like it if somebody did it to you? The golden rule, which is universal in all cultures, which has been incorporated into various religions but doesn't have a religious basis. It is a principle of ethics which any child can understand, and you can develop further principles of ethics on the basis of that. And then when the child grows up, can perhaps study more advanced principles of moral philosophy. I do not think that basing your moral view upon religion, a particular religion such as the Christian religion, can possibly be the right way to do it. For example, if we take Christianity, what would be moral principles that you derive from Christianity? One way to do it would be to derive them from Scripture. And I certainly hope you wouldn't do that. You can read the Old Testament, even the New Testament. I'm prepared to defend that, if you want me to. You would not get a decent set of morals by studying the Bible. Nor would you get a decent set of morals by saying, I'm afraid of God, so I'd better be good because God might punish me. That's not a very noble reason for being good. There are much more noble reasons for being good, such as thinking about other people, how would you like it, and so on. If anybody wants me to defend what I said about the Bible, then I'm happy to do so.
Okay. Isn't do as you would be done by something Jesus advocated?
Of course he did, and so did all the other great teachers, whether religious or not.
Okay. Yes, missed you the last time.
A question that has bothered me for some time, but the more I think about things as I get older, I suppose, is what spawned religion in the first place? Where was that first moment where religions, where people suddenly thought?
You mean in history, in evolution?
In history, really, yes.
Yeah, I think I've kind of answered that when I talked about the psychological predispositions and cavemen, cave children, let's say, but believing what their children tell them. I think that's probably the same question, and also the thing about the leopard in the long grass. Yeah.
Okay, behind. Yeah.
Going back to what you said about psychological predispositions, in the book you carry on and you outline how certain aspects of the doctrine of particularly the big three monotheistic religions exploit these psychological predispositions. You use a mimetic framework to explain it. And what I want to know is, do you see it as your duty to make the memes that make up the current scientific zeitgeist fitter in the battle that they're going at the moment with religion?
Right. Well, the phrase the moral zeitgeist, which you mention, I am very persuaded by the view that the morals that a society has and the ethical values that it has are very much labels of the time. So if you take our own society, we are 21st century people. And the values that we hold, things like having no truck with slavery, regarding women as equal, and trying to avoid cruelty whenever we can, and so on. These are very different from the values that, say, medieval people had, or even Victorian people had. So we are labelled as 21st century moralists, whether we're religious or not, whereas a 19th century thinker would have been labelled a 19th century, with 19th century values. again, whether they were religious or not. I think striking examples are people like T.H. Huxley and Charles Darwin himself, actually, who were in the vanguard of advanced liberal progressive thought of their time, and yet were, by today's standards, appalling racists. Today, there still are people who are more advanced than others, but nevertheless, everybody in our society in the 21st century is more progressive, more advanced in that kind of thing than anybody was in the 19th century, and certainly than anybody was in the Middle Ages. So this shifting moral zeitgeist is a mysterious phenomenon, but it's an undoubted phenomenon. It's palpably obvious that it happens. And it seems to rather kind of leave religion behind. I mean, religious figures may, from time to time, be influential in changing the zeitgeist. And it's an interesting question to ask, what does change the zeitgeist? I think it's a rather complicated mixture of parliamentary debates, legal precedents, dinner party conversations, journalism, novels, a whole lot of a sort of festering stew of the culture sees to it that we are labeled 24. I mean, even in my lifetime, even when I was a boy in the 1950s, the way we thought about things was tangibly different. And if you go back to the 1920s and read novels, read just ordinary pulp thrillers like Agatha Christie or Bulldog Drummond or something, I mean, terrible racism, anti-Semitism, and sexism. You can almost label, you can almost diagnose the decade in the 20th century when a novel was written by picking up subtle hints from the way the characters behave and the way they talk about their values. Steven Pinker has written a great big book on kind of this subject. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he tries to show that historically the world is getting better in spite of terrible catastrophes like the First World War and the Nazis. If you look at the broad sweep of history, we are getting nicer, we're getting less cruel, we're getting kinder. You see it in the difference between, say, the recent Gulf War, George W. Bush's Gulf War, where civilian casualties were regarded as something to apologize for. I mean, Rumsfeld, that we just heard about, would say something to the effect that, it's unfortunate that some civilians got killed by this bomb, and we'll, try to do better in future, but stuff happens. In the Second World War, civilian casualties were what it was all about. That was what they were doing, bombing Dresden, bombing Coventry, bombing Nagasaki. And if you go further back, terrible things that people did, terrible tortures, terrible things that label the time rather than any religion or anything like that. I think it's a most striking phenomenon which deserves a lot of study, and Steven Pinker has given it a lot of study.
Can I ask how much longer you're prepared to do this?
Oh gosh, yeah, it's 5 to 10.
Can we give it another 10 minutes?
Whatever people want, I'm happy to. But if people want to leave.
Finlay.
Don't think the microphone works.
Is it on? Is it switched on?
All right. Does it ever concern you that your approach may strengthen the hand of Christians, that they have to marshal their resources, and that you generate a lot of fear in people, and in a state of fear they may in fact strengthen their Christian beliefs so as to make their own lives more comfortable? And I cannot but contrast your approach with your hero Darwin, and what he would think of this way of, for example, talking
Yes, I mean, there is an interesting contrast between Darwin and Huxley. And Huxley, as you know, was known as Darwin's bulldog, and he took up the cudgels on Darwin's behalf. Darwin was a gentleman. Darwin was an invalid, actually, and what didn't really feel up to a sort of cut and thrust of public debate, and left that to Huxley and Hooker and his other colleagues. I hope I don't engender fear in people. I don't think I'm a very fear-inspiring person. If you think I am likely to turn people back to their religion, I don't think that happens very often. There was a suggestion last night, but I think that was tongue-in-cheek. No, I don't worry about that. As for the idea that that I'm turning people away from, what was the phrase used, their comfort or something like that, I don't think that comfort is a very good reason to believe anything. If you can believe something because it's comforting, then I guess you can do it, but most people believe something because they've seen evidence for it. Steven Pinker, again, made the rather jokey point that if you're being attacked by a tiger, it may comfort you to believe it's a rabbit, but actually it is a tiger. Well, I think Darwin was actually asked why he didn't call himself an atheist. He called himself an agnostic. And he said he didn't, words to the effect, this is not the exact words, but words to the effect that the common people, that shows again this sort of shifting zeitgeist, to use a phrase like that, are not yet ready for atheism. So he was using a more diplomatic, conciliatory approach, which many of my colleagues do today as well. And to some extent it might be a politically valuable, politically useful way to do it. My own, what I care about is the truth, and so I don't like to temper what I say. I don't like to sacrifice truth for the sake of diplomacy. I would not make a good ambassador.
Yes.
I want to thank you again for coming up. There's a few points I would like to make. The first one is that the new atheists tend to attack Christianity, not really religion. I mean, Sam Harris has written a book in America, The End of Faith, and had he written a book which was The End of Christianity, had he written that as The End of Islam and tried to publish it in Saudi Arabia, he would have had to rename it at The End of Sam Harris.
That's unfair.
It's not unfair.
One of the really striking things about Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, is that it does go into Islam a great deal, and in very damnatory terms. It even begins, the very first opening paragraph is an anti-Islam passage. So I mean, you may be thinking of his later book, Letter to a Christian Nation, which was, I think, his second book, which really does, as its title suggests, attack Christianity. But The End of Faith really does give it to Islam in a big way.
Well, compared to what he said about Christianity, I said very little about Islam. But the other thing I was going to say to you, you seem to divorce science from Christianity. Now, the pioneers in science, many of them were theists. There was Newton, for example, there was Blaise Pascal, there was Bacon, and many others. And many of the scientists of today, some of them work with you, John Lennox, for example. You've got Francis Collins, you've got Alistair McGrath, all of them Christian scientists. And there is no way, Christianity explores science and accepts science. We're not afraid of science. And as Francis said earlier, we're very happy to pass that on to the next generation. And you also have said yourself, I think, and forgive me if I'm wrong, and you said that the God hypothesis can be tested scientifically to be shown to be false. Well, I would suggest that you need a lot of faith for that.
No, I never said that. As Francis Spufford said, I said it's very improbable. I didn't say it could be disproved. Let me deal with the question of religious scientists. Of course, Newton, etc., were religious. You couldn't be anything else in their time. You've got to remember these were men of their time. They lived before Darwin. It would be very, very difficult to be an atheist before Darwin. So, of course, Newton was religious. Of course, Pascal was religious. Now, when you come on to present times and you quote the really rather pathetic list of Francis Collins and John Lennox and Alistair McGrath, I mean, it's not a very impressive list, is it? It doesn't match up to Newton and Pascal. Whereas if you look at the vast, I mean, I actually gave figures, 90% of the Fellows of the Royal Society, 90% of the members of the National Academy of Scientists are non-believers.
Well,
there is a 10% who are believers, that's true.
If we go back to Pascal, Pascal did not begin his quest for faith as a believer. He was an atheist. And you will be aware of Pascal's wager. When he weighed the probabilities, he decided in favor of Christianity. So you can hardly say that Pascal was obviously a Christian because he was before Darwin.
Well, I'm well aware of Pascal's wager. Yeah. And I'm sure you're well aware of the various fallacies of it. Do everybody know about Pascal's wager? The chance of there being a God may be very low, but on the other hand, if there is one and you bet wrong, then you're for it when you go up that presupposes first that the one thing God really wants is for you to believe in him, rather than for you to be an intelligent person, a kind person, a good person, a charitable person. The one thing he really wants is for people to believe in him. If you don't believe in him, you're going straight to hell. Suggests a degree of paranoia, which I wouldn't have thought that you would want in your God. The other question is, what if you're backing the wrong God? What if you get up there and you find it's Baal, or Zeus, or Wotan? Right, down you go. I mean, Pascal's wager isn't a sensible argument.
Are you suggesting that Pascal wasn't a sensible person then?
Of course I'm not. He was a great mathematician.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's an interesting piece of verbal trickery, and I can easily see that one would advance it as a nice piece of argument that's an after-dinner conversation. Of course, it's an interesting argument.
And you wouldn't consider Francis Collins to be on a list of eminent scientists?
I would. I mean,
you've just said that you wouldn't.
He's a good geneticist, and he's a great administrator, and he ran the Human Genome Project after Jim Watson resigned. But his reason for believing in God is, I mean, I've read his book, and it just doesn't stand up to the same sort of scrutiny as his scientific work would.
Okay, we're going to 10 minutes. Is that reasonable?
Yeah.
Okay, 10 minutes to get anybody else in. No, you've had enough. Let me see. Yes, there's a hand.
Can I just start off by saying you're like a massive idol of mine?
I didn't hear. He didn't hear. What was that?
You're like a massive idol of mine.
Oh.
It's quite a large question right now in Scotland, and I was just wondering if you think like homosexuality has something genetic in it, if it's like a genetic thing, or is it really like the creationist said choice?
Is it genetic? What you believe? Do you mean?
I think he's asking us whether homosexuality is genetic or acquired.
The word. Okay. The way you answer that kind of question is, well, there are various ways, but one of the most powerful ways is twin studies. What you do is exploit the fact that you know that identical twins, monozygotic twins, have all the same genes with a few tiny exceptions. Whereas ordinary twins, say twin brothers or twin sisters who are not identical, just like ordinary brothers, they have 50% of their genes in the sense that it matters in common. compared with general population. So if you look at something like homosexuality, or indeed height or intelligence or musical ability or mathematical ability or high jumping ability, anything you like, and you compare how similar identical twins are to each other with how similar fraternal twins are to each other, if you find that, to take an extreme case, every time one identical twin is gay, the other one always is. Whereas every time a fraternal twin is gay, it's only a much smaller probability that the brother will be. Then that's strong evidence that there's a genetic component to the variance. And it's very seldom as clear-cut as that, but you can do the mathematics on it, and the answer is, for homosexuality, yes, there is a stronger correlation between identical twins than fraternal twins in sexual orientation. And this is true even in those rare cases where identical twins are, or where twins are reared apart. Sometimes, for various unfortunate reasons, twins get separated at birth and brought up in different families, sometimes in different countries. And that they're a particular goldmine for researchers in this field. They gravitate to these twins who've been separated at birth like magnets, because they're wonderful research material. And for a large number of characteristics, it turns out that identical twins who've been separated at birth still resemble each other in all sorts of psychological characteristics, including homosexuality. So there is a genetic component to it, but it's not 100%.
Who's closest? First. Well.
Many thanks for a very entertaining evening. You've answered the questions exceptionally well. In that case, I'm actually quite keen. You showed a picture of Ardoyne earlier on in your slides, and I was just wanting to know what your personal view was on the role of religion in the current Northern Ireland, because I can pretty much, maybe it's controversial, but I can pretty much guarantee anyone in that picture or anyone in that Ardoyne that day wouldn't know the meaning of the word church or chapel.
Yes. I think that's a very interesting point, and it's often said that the dispute in Northern Ireland is not about religion. It's about culture, it's about economic oppression, it's about political oppression, and so on. Now, let's suppose that's true, and let's suppose that actually the people who are fighting in Northern Ireland, or were fighting in Northern Ireland, don't actually know about, don't actually understand or care about the theological differences. They don't rush into a bar and say, take that transubstantiationist scum, or something like that. It's much more likely to be something like a transgenerational vendetta. It was the prods who killed my grandfather, or it was the Catholics who killed my father, and therefore I'm going to go and take revenge on other people of the same type. The same type just means a label. It just means a label for us versus them, and unfortunately humans are extremely prone to us versus them thinking. In places where skin color differs, notoriously skin color can be used as a label. In places where there are different languages spoken, like Belgium, where half the population, not half, some proportion of the population speak French, and the other speak Dutch, and this is a source of friction. In Northern Ireland, religion is the label. Religion, it's not the theology, it's not the difference in belief, it's just that certain people are known to be Catholics. It really comes back to what I was talking about, labeling children with the religion of their parents. They don't actually believe the different things that they're supposed to believe. It's just that they're brought up as Catholics. They have Catholic parents. They went to Catholic schools. Psychological experiments have been done in which children have been given an arbitrary label, something as simple as a T-shirt of a particular color. Give half the children green T-shirts, half the children, say, orange T-shirts. And this automatically causes them to form loyalties to the other children who have the same label. They form gangs, they form enmities, they have gang warfare. Now just imagine that you make a rule that when they grow up, orange children are only ever allowed to marry other orange children, and green children only ever marry green children. And then make a rule that orange children always go to orange schools and green children always go to green schools. And you carry that on for 300 years. And what have you got? Well, you know what we've got. It's an arbitrary label.
Okay, this gentleman, just 2 more questions maybe.
Hi, I was wondering, since kids aren't capable of being religious themselves and are in some cases extremely traumatized by, visions of hell and brimstone and all that, do you believe they deserve some sort of legal protection from, being threatened with hell or whatever, like a religious age of consent or something?
No, it's very difficult because one doesn't want to come across as sort of dictatorial, tyrannical, trying to, I've been accused of wanting to take children away from their parents and put them in concentration camps or something. I don't believe in that. I believe in consciousness raising. I believe in persuading people to think for themselves and to say, whenever you hear the phrase Catholic child, stop and say, what do you mean by Catholic child? Is it right to talk about a child? And maybe it's okay for a 14-year-old, but to talk about a 4-year-old child as a Catholic child, should you really be doing that? So I don't want to go as far as some of my colleagues who actually call it child abuse. But I do think that labeling children with the religion of their parents when they're too young to know is a form of child abuse. But I don't think that just bringing them up in that religion should be called child abuse. But I do think we need to raise consciousness. Now, terrifying children with hellfire seems to me to be perilously close to child abuse. It's mental child abuse, not physical child abuse, but if it genuinely terrifies them, and I think the evidence is clear that it does, even as I said before, into adulthood, then I think that is a form of psychological abuse. And I've even heard from individuals, a woman, for example, wrote to me from America saying that as a 7-year-old child, she was physically, sexually abused by a priest, and she was also told by the same priest, I think, or at least maybe another priest, that a little friend of hers, another 7-year-old girl who had died, had gone to hell because she was a Protestant. And this woman told me that of those 2 abuses, the physical sexual abuse was the less traumatic than being told that her friend had gone to hell because she was a Protestant. The physical sexual abuse she merely thought was yucky, but the being told about hell, being told that her friend had gone to hell, traumatized her for years. So I think there is a case for saying that some kinds of indoctrination of children should properly be classified as abuse. But I think the proper remedy for it is not draconian seizing of children away from their families, but rather trying to raise consciousness, trying to educate.
Okay. Last question. You got the mic? Can you just give it to the lady in front of you there? Okay.
Can I just say that someone brought up in a relatively strict Muslim household, I have a lot of time and respect for you, but perhaps unfairly, how do you, what are your thoughts on how society and how we should deal with the whole Muslim the Islamic intolerance towards any sort of criticism of the religion or of the Prophet?
I think it's pretty appalling that we are so tolerant ourselves of people who not only believe that apostates should be executed, believe that infidels should be executed, and they don't, many of them actually do it, but nevertheless it's part of their creed that apostates should be punished, that people who've given up Islam should be punished by death, We see honor killings, we see female circumcision, female genital mutilation going on in England, for sure, and the police turning a blind eye.
To be fair, that is more an African cultural concept.
Well, maybe it
than
is, but the
Islamic,
fact is
so-
that the police turn a blind eye to it because they think it's Islam and they're terrified of being called Islamophobic. And this word Islamophobia has become so embedded in our culture, we're all terrified of being called Islamophobic. Now, a phobia is an irrational fear. A rational fear is not a phobia, it's just a rational fear. I was on a panel, a TV panel, with who was then England's leading Muslim, Sir Iqbal Sakrani, knighted for services to what were called community relations. And I pressed him again and again to answer the question, is apostasy punishable by death? Again and again he evaded the question. And finally he said, oh, well, it is, but it's not often enforced. As though that were a good answer. It's a disgrace that a religion that prescribes death, the death penalty, for anybody who leaves the religion. You can see why they do it. It's a good way to stop people leaving. You can see why they do it. Now, of course, the vast majority of individual Muslims wouldn't dream of doing anything so terrible. But nevertheless, they're taught it in their madrasas, and it only takes a small minority of those who are taught that to think that they're right to put it into practice, and those are the ones that you see becoming suicide bombers, becoming terrorists. It doesn't take very many people, it takes only a minority, and if all the children of a culture are taught these things, are taught that faith is a virtue, are taught that you don't need to justify your beliefs but simply say, that is my belief, that's an end to the argument, I won't talk about it because it's my faith and that's what I've been taught. It only takes a small minority of those to then put that into practice. And as we've seen, there are just about enough of them to cause terrible things to happen. So I do think Islam is one of the great evils of the world, although the vast majority of individual Muslims, of course, are not. They died because of communism and Nazism. I mean, Stalin and Hitler both had moustaches. What's it got to do with atheism? No, Hitler had bonkers beliefs about race and an ideology based on sort of sub-Wagnerian ravings. Stalin was an ideological communist. Neither of them had anything to do with atheism. Stalin happened to be an atheist. Hitler happened to be a Catholic. It's nothing to do with what they did.
Okay, well, Professor Dawkins. Professor Dawkins has been answering questions. I make it for coming up to an hour and a half now, so I think he's kind of, well, I'm going to have the last one. Just on a topical note, what are your views on the fact that by this time next week we might have a Mormon president?
I think it's rather an odd fact that Americans are so terrified of raising the question of religion. They're so imbued with the absolutely correct constitutional doctrine of separation of church and state. The Constitution, the First Amendment, states that no religious test shall ever be imposed on a candidate standing for office, and that, of course, is absolutely right. So there must never be a rule that says you cannot be a Mormon and stand for. Just in our country, we have the rule that a Catholic can't be monarch. The American Constitution forbids that. Nevertheless, it seems to me perfectly right that an individual voter should weigh up all the qualities, all the properties of a candidate in deciding whether to vote for him. And if you have a candidate who believes that in the 19th century, in the 1830s, a man called Joseph Smith dug up some golden tablets on which were written some characters in Reformed Egyptian, which no archaeologist knows anything about, read them with the aid of a magic stone in a magic hat, and was later convicted of being a fraud and a charlatan, and believes that the North American Indians, the Native Americans, are a lost tribe of Israel, and until, I think, 1978, believed that black people were inferior, and still, as far as we know, believe that they have the mark of Cain. I think that a voter is entitled to know about that and is entitled to ask a presidential candidate, do you really believe that nonsense or do you not? And that journalists should ask him, and that it should be raised in presidential debates. But Americans have this very, very hands-off policy. They'll ask him about his taxation policy, his foreign policy. But to ask him whether he believes these barking mad beliefs, you're not allowed to do. And I think that's a great shame.
Okay, well, shortly we're going to get a couple of tables up here, and Professor Dawkins very kindly, and Francis Bufford, to agree to sign their books if you wish to have them signed. But in the meantime, I think we should all show a great round of appreciation for Professor Dawkins for such a stimulating and, well, prolonged question and answer session. So thank you very much for coming. I think it's a prize.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for joining us at Lanntair for the Falkland talks by Francis Spofford on his book Unapologetic, followed by Professor Richard Dawkins on his book and beliefs, The God Delusion. Much stimulating debate and discussion there, and I'm sure it will go on through the night amongst all everybody who's been here. But in the meantime, from Lanntair,
Thank you.